Are you a Bible-believing Christian? Well, if you are, and if you happen to have been alive during the Antebellum South, the Antebellum Slavocracy, then it is most likely that you would have used your religion to justify the enslavement of Africans and people of African descent and to support white supremacy. And today we're going to look at an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery by Thomas R. Cobb, who is affectionately known by Confederates and the Antebellum South as the James Madison of the Confederacy because of how instrumental he was in drafting the Confederate Constitution. And in one of the sections of this book, he talks about slavery viewed in light of Revelation. And I'm making this video because I've watched many YouTubers now bring up and discuss with modern religious individuals, people who are Christians today, the justification of slavery in the Bible. Now, this video has nothing to do with attacking Christianity or any faith at all. It is a fact that if you were a Christian and if you were alive during the Antebellum Slavocracy, if you were in the South, then it is more likely than not that you used religion or you sat in the pews of preachers and pastors and priests who used religion and the Bible as a justification for the enslavement of Africans and to support white supremacy. So that is just a fact, and there is nothing you could do to argue it. Did abolitionists in the North use the Bible and religion to further their abolitionist motives? Of course they did. But we cannot avoid the fact that the Bible was used as an instrument of white supremacy and the enslavement of Africans in the antebellum South. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're not only going to look at Thomas R. Cobb, we're going to look at many different religious groups and their position concerning slavery and white supremacy. And this all ties into the fact that these individuals, these jurists and these religious individuals and government officials all believed that the system of African slavery was just and right and followed the law of nature because whites were superior to people of African descent, and people of African descent, their natural condition was to be in a state of slavery. So when you hear all of these Confederate sympathizers and neo-Confederates talk about glorifying the Confederacy and the antebellum South, it's important that we remind them and remind people that this was a society that was a slave society. It was based entirely on white supremacy and on the inferiority of the African based on what these people believed. So we're going to pick up in Thomas R. Cobb's An Inquiry into the Law of Negro Slavery in his chapter, Slavery Viewed in Light of Revelation. So he starts by saying, the law of the Lord is perfect. So according to him, he believes that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, so what it says must be true. Its general teachings are not only true, but by no implication can sin find an apology or an excuse therein. This law was not intended for any particular age or people. It is that universal law of God which Christ came not to destroy, but to fulfill. So what he's saying is that the Bible cannot justify sin. So if it's in the Bible and it is condoned, then it must be something ordained by God. He starts by looking at Abraham. He says, we found in him, Abraham, a large slaveholder, and God blessed him. How? By opening his eyes to the sin of slavery? No, but by giving him flocks and herds and silver and gold and men servants and maid servants and camels and asses. So what he is saying is that Abraham was a slaveholder, and God never condemned Abraham for being a slaveholder. Rather, he blessed him for being a good individual. And clearly, owning slaves was one part of that righteousness of his character. He says God not only gave slaves to Abraham as evidence of his blessing, so to bless Abraham, God gave him slaves. So clearly giving someone slaves is a reward for doing good or for being a good person. But he says, but he commanded the Jews to make slaves of the heathen round about them. Now, this is where we're going to see Thomas Cobb tie in to what I've said in previous video lessons here on the channel, that slavery was only right and just if it was natural, and it was only natural if a superior race enslaved an inferior race because the inferior race would benefit from that enslavement. This is why white people could not be slaves to other white people. It did nothing to benefit their nature, whereas the inferior African being enslaved to white overlords, and this is really difficult and hard to say, but this is the horrific history of our past that we need to confront when we see Confederate sympathizers and people like that today. the fact that the inferior African would benefit from being enslaved to the Caucasian meant that it was within the law of nature to have that system of slavery. So now he's going to use the Bible to justify this. He says, at the same time, God commanded them that if thy brother by thee be waxen poor and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as a hired servant and a sojourner. Revelation, here sustaining the conclusion to which the natural law points, that inferiority of race is necessary to make slavery consistent with divine will. So clearly what he's saying is that you must have a superior race enslave an inferior race, and it is only that enslavement which is condoned and talked about by the Bible. So he's using the Bible to justify that white supremacy justifies the enslavement of people of African descent. He says, if slavery is sinful, if it is morally wrong per se, and under all circumstances, God could not in his nature have authorized or enjoined it. If it was not sinful in the Jews, it is not sinful under all circumstances. And the question of its morality in every case depends on its circumstances, precisely the conclusion to which we have previously arrived. So he's clearly saying that we have already discussed, talking about the law, that the superior white race enslaving the inferior African race is not contrary to the law of nature because it benefits the African's condition. And clearly he says here the Bible supports that by saying that slavery is ordained by God if a superior race enslaves an inferior race because it is for the benefit of the inferior race. He then also talks about, okay, so that's the Old Testament. Well, what about the New Testament? What does it say here? He says, but let us enter into the bright light of Christianity as developed in the New Testament and examine the question there. That there is no direct positive prohibition of slavery, nor even a hint by Christ or his apostles that its principle or practice was against the divine will is admitted. So he's saying that clearly here we see nowhere in the entire corpus of the New Testament that God condemns slavery. Since it's not condemned and it is allowed, therefore it is not sinful as long as it is based on that law of nature, as we saw in the previous part, where he says a superior race can enslave an inferior race, and here he's specifically talking about Caucasians enslaving people of African descent. But then he gets into another interesting point. He says, well, what about that great law of do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Would we really want to be slaves? So he discusses that. He says, let's examine it. The analysis of the rule is we should act towards others not as they act towards us, not as the law of the land allows us to act, but as we would have them act towards us were our respective situations reversed. How would we have them act towards us in all cases? According to our whims and childish desires? If so, we must give free scope to the crude wishes of our children. We must release the condemned convict, for thus it is that we would have them act towards us were our situations reversed. So what he's saying is that, a prisoner, right, would want to be free, and if we were in their situation, we would want them to free us, so therefore we should free them. And children constantly want certain things, and we should do that because if we were in their situation, we would want the same things, but we don't do that, do we? We don't give children everything that they want. We don't give a convicted prisoner freedom simply because if we were in that spot, we would want that as well. He says that such is not the rule. He goes on to say, we would have them act towards us in all cases in that manner which would tend most to promote our real good and happiness, even though we could not ourselves see it. We should deal in the same way with the slaves. We should act towards them in all cases in that manner which tends most to promote their real good and happiness. In that manner, which will most assuredly elevate them physically, intellectually, and morally. For so, according to the golden rule, we would have them to act towards us. If the condition of bondage does actually promote their real good and happiness, then this precept sanctions and enjoins it. So what he is saying is, since slavery is good towards the enslaved, even though they might say, we want to be free, then the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, what it really means is that we are doing what is right for the enslaved. We're doing what is right for the African because they are better to be enslaved than to be free. Therefore, just like we instruct a child, even though a child may not think it's what's best for them, it may not be what they want, The slave doesn't really know what they want. They need to be enslaved because that is their best situation, and that is what we're doing for them by keeping them enslaved. He says, our conclusion is that until the nature of the African Negro becomes by some means radically changed, there is nothing in his enslavement contrary to the law of his nature. Therefore, being enslaved for someone of African descent, anyone from Africa, is their natural condition that God intended them to be in. And as long as slavery is a superior race, Caucasians, enslaving an inferior race, Africans, then Thomas R. Cobb says, forget even the law, the human law, by divine law, it is a perfectly natural and right thing to do. Now, it's not just him. This was supported by many religious groups in the antebellum South. For example, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church declared in 1861 that the slave system had generally proven kindly and benevolent, and has provided real effective discipline to a people who could not be elevated in any other way. Slavery, they concluded, was the black man's normal condition. So again, as long as slavery is superior Caucasians enslaving inferior Africans, then it is not only the rule of law of man, it is ordained by God. Episcopal Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia had this to say. He said that consider whether by their inference with this institution, they may not be checking and impeding a work which is manifestly providential. For nearly 100 years, the English and American churches have been striving to civilize and Christianize Western Africa. And with what result? Around Sierra Leone and in the neighborhood of Cape Palmas, a few natives have been made Christians, and some nations have been civilized. But what a small number in comparison with the thousands, nay, I say millions, who have learned the way to heaven and who have been made to know their Savior through the means of African slavery. At this very moment, there are from 3 to 4 million Africans educating for earth and for heaven in the so vilified southern states, learning the very best lessons from a semi-barbarous people, lessons of self-control, of obedience, of perseverance, of adaptation to means to ends, learning above all where their weakness lies and how they may acquire strength for the battle of life. These considerations satisfy me with their condition and assure me that it is the best relation they can for the present be made to occupy. So what he's saying is he was actually confronting abolitionists and talking about how horrible slavery was. He was saying, no, slavery is great for Africans because we've tried to go over and civilize them in Africa, and it can't be done. Only in a state of submission, a state of slavery, have they learned self-control, have they learned obedience, perseverance, have they learned the way to heaven, and that this condition, slavery, is the best condition that they can occupy. So, again, this isn't an attack on Christianity or people who have religious beliefs, but it is merely showing you that Christianity and the Bible was used to justify the institution of African slavery in the antebellum South, in the slavocracy. It was used to justify white supremacy and to say that the system of white supremacy, of whites enslaving Africans, was not only in line with the law of man, it was in line with the law of God, with divine revelation, because the natural condition of the African was one to exist in a state of slavery. So as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, and if you want to learn more about the horrors that was the antebellum South, the slavocracy, come back for the next video lesson, and I'll see you the next time.